And the reality is that China and Russia are more important to the United States at the moment than India. And for now, we should assume that tariffs are going to just be this tool that's going to be used by the U.S. to address any issues that it sees in any relationship. The U.S. will be dominant, for now at least, in breakthroughs, but China will be dominant in the adoption and application of AI. By doing tariffs on India, what does it cost the U.S.? Not really much.
Hello and welcome to another episode of In Focus. I'm G. Sampath. India-China relations have been bogged down by two major irritants, the border issue and China's close military collaboration with Pakistan. But now, both India and China are looking for a reset in bilateral ties. This assumes significance, especially in the context of the Trump administration's 50% tariffs on Indian exports. India doesn't want its growth trajectory derailed by these tariffs, and it makes sense to explore all options for protecting India's economic interests. Prime Minister Modi will be meeting President Xi Jinping in Tianjin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, and bilateral economic cooperation is very much on the agenda. So, given the historical tensions and trust deficit between the two countries, can India benefit from a pivot to China? And if the answer is yes, how would it work? To discuss these questions, we are joined today by Cameron Johnson, Senior Partner, Tidal Wave Solutions, Shanghai, who is also a former Vice Chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. He is a leading expert on Chinese manufacturing, trade, and supply chain management. So Cameron, thank you so much for coming to the Hindu office. Welcome to In Focus.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
So to start with, Cameron, I was going to ask you about these 50% tariffs which the Trump administration has imposed on India. Until recently, there was all this talk of the West decoupling from China, and India was spoken of as a possible alternative manufacturing hub, as a counterweight to China in this region, and so on and so forth. But now things seem to have taken a very different direction. So what are your thoughts on this targeting? This weaponization of tariffs is one thing, but this is especially sort of directed at India. So how do you understand this development?
I think the first thing to look at is why is the U.S. doing tariffs in general, right? I think it's important to understand kind of the U.S. psyche and mentality behind that, particularly this administration. There's basically four major reasons why they're implementing tariffs. One is to reshore manufacturing back to the United States. There's a feeling amongst a large percentage of the population that the China shock, where factories went overseas, particularly to China, that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that united Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, that also lost a lot of jobs out of the United States. So there's a feeling amongst a large percent of the population that globalization has not been good for us. And so part of reshoring manufacturing is to kind of bring a lot of those jobs back so the blue-collar, middle-class worker can have a home, they can have a car, they can pay for college for the kids, these kinds of things. And you can move up the economic ladder. That is not happening now in the United States. In the last generation or so about 30 years, putting aside some of the inflation-related wage gains, the average household income has stayed stable, right? It has not really gone up. Whereas, of course, the richer have gotten richest, right? Beyond that, the next is really the trade deficits. The U.S. feels that particularly countries that have trade deficits or taking advantage of the United States. Think China and the U.S., for example, is the perfect example in that. And so the U.S. is trying to put tariffs on to balance that out. We want fair and balanced trade, right? The third is domestic politics. Again, when you look at blue-collar workers, you also have the challenges of getting jobs. Of course, the rich are getting richer, right? There's this big disparity. There's also a feeling that if you don't have manufacturing, you're missing out on a key component of economics in general, right? But the kind of this process knowledge and industry where it can touch so many different aspects of your business culture. And finally, national security. We do not want to be reliant on countries for certain products. Again, when you look at China and the recent issues with rare earths, this is now kind of the calling card. So I would say those are the four major reasons why, at least for the United States, they're implementing tariffs. When you get to India, the reality is it doesn't make sense. if you read Peter Navarro's article in the Foreign or in Financial Times 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, essentially he laid out all of the U.S. arguments, right? Everything from unfair market practices, high tariffs on U.S. goods, lack of market access for U.S. products, including agricultural goods, right, and the buying of Russian oil. Is that really something that moves the needle for the U.S.? I'd argue no. The reality is the U.S. views India as a rising economic partner. India views the U.S. as a needed market, right? So basically, the relationship is unbalanced. And the reality is that China and Russia are more important to the United States at the moment than India. And I say at the moment because these things, are constantly evolving and changing. So when you actually look at what's happening, to your point, with the tariffs also, India last year exported about 18% of its tariffs to the United States. That's about double any other country. I think the UAE is number 2 with about 8 billion. And so there really is an imbalance. I think, and this is kind of the more conspiratorial version, which I do hear from certain corridors, is that by doing tariffs on India, what does it cost the U.S.? Not really much, because India needs the U.S. more. And it sends a signal to Russia that we will go after you. And it sends a signal to China that, hey, we're not doing it to you, right? So it positions them more favorably for upcoming negotiations. I don't know if I buy that, but it definitely is. These are different ideas that are coming out of the discourse, particularly in the U.S. Overall, the challenge is we don't know where this is going. And for now, we should assume that tariffs are going to just be this tool that's going to be used by the U.S. to address any issues that it sees in any relationship.
You mentioned at the end that tariffs are going to be used as a tool. I think that is a dominant perception in India. I mean, over and above all the other factors you pointed to, it is being seen as a negotiating tool in the context of the free trade deal, the deal that Trump keeps talking about. So is that something more important in terms of the other factors you've spoken about, that is primarily aimed at getting the deal that would be favorable to the US, and this is meant to pressure India to come on the same page as what the US is aiming at in terms of the deal, rather than all the other factors? Maybe there is a point to be made politically about India buying Russian oil, but the real issue here is the deal that Russia wants, opening up India's agricultural sector, getting GM products into India, the dairy sector. Are these the real issues, and this is just a bargaining tactic? Is that something you would agree with?
Potentially, and I say potentially because the reality is nobody really knows. The administration has sent so many different signals, right? It's about Russian oil, that's why we're doing it. No, it's about market practices. No, it's about, India's high tariffs. No, it's about, India won't let in our agricultural products. So the reality is it's probably a mix of all of that, and it just depends on the day you're talking to somebody in the administration. That does not help India. But what the U.S. has shown is that they will definitely use tariffs to both influence negotiations and try to get things their way, and also punish countries that do not do what the U.S. thinks they should be doing. And I put inside India, I use Brazil as an example, where the U.S. is going to or trying to implement tariffs on Brazil for its treatment of Bolsonaro, right, in the elections a couple years ago. So this isn't only an India challenge to some regard. It's a challenge for everybody in the world. And the reality is any agreement that the United States does make with India, it would be safe to assume that that agreement probably is not going to hold for a very long time. Because, if there's a flare-up somewhere, India buys Russian gas, or doesn't buy enough fighter jets, I don't know. I mean, you can think of any reason.
We've seen that already happen in the case of Iran, right? They had a nuclear agreement which Trump tore up, basically.
That's far more complicated. I'm not an expert on.
Okay, right,
I'm not an expert on
we'll
that.
Stick to economics.
So that's right. I'm just a supply chain guy.
Okay.
But I think the reality is one can look at the actions of tariffs as it's not purely an economic treatment issue. Hey, you are not buying enough goods from me, so we're gonna put tariffs on. Oh, you're flooding our market with goods, we're gonna put tariffs on to protect our industries. Those are the historical, traditional ways you would use tariffs. All of that has now gone out the window.
Right. Now, coming to the India-China aspect, Cameron, there have been two major irritants in India-China ties. One, of course, is the border issue, The other one is China's collaboration, military collaboration with Pakistan, which India sees as a major sponsor of cross-border terrorism. These have been like irritants in the relationship for quite some time now. But since last year, there was a meeting in Kazan in last October between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. And even before that, there has been some kind of rethinking of India-China relations in India and as well as in China. And this month, Modi is again going to be meeting President Xi in China on the sidelines of the SCO summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. So there is clearly an energy in terms of opening up economically with China for greater economic cooperation. Indian businesses are interested, there's no doubt about it. And let's say there are two major factions or voices at the moment. One is, of course, the traditional pro-US sentiment voices, which believe that, okay, the Trump tariffs are a storm in the teacup. Let's just not overreact. It will, if we weather it, maybe things will come back to track soon. Okay, that is one side. The other side is quite unhappy with what is seen as bullying from the US side, and there is a nationalist side to it as well in terms of economic nationalism. You can't have a country like the US infringing on India's sovereignty. It's our business who we buy our oil from. You can't dictate that to us. So this thinking is sort of leading also into this entire, what, for want of a better phrase, pivot to China. But at the same time, while we're looking to reset ties with China, there is this unease in terms of how there is a danger of over-dependence on China given the huge trade deficit. I was just looking at the top 20 trading partners of China, and India is in the top 20, but in terms of exports to China, India is at number 20. We export even less to China than countries like Thailand and Philippines, which are much smaller economies. So there is this discomfort with sort of getting too close to China economically, because many feel China can just take over and you may end up being a junior partner. So in this context, how do you see that India can benefit from this pivot to China?
Yeah, it absolutely can. I think you pointed out there are many historical and current challenges in the relationship. But to be honest, this is true of any two countries. So I think the real focus is where are the low-hanging fruit and the easier wins, right, that both countries can have. We just saw they restored flight access, direct flight access. This is a positive. They're giving visas again, right? This is a positive. So these are all areas where it doesn't really cost either country anything to do. To your point, how do we then move on to whatever the next stage is? And I think there's a couple things that you can look at. It's absolutely true that because of U.S. actions, the world is now turning away from a U.S. mindset world, right? Where you had a trading system for the last 80 years, the GATT, then the WTO, but all of that is now blown up. And the reality is we don't know what tomorrow looks like. So you have to build it out yourself. And let's focus on Asia because that's where we live and that's where we do business. The reality is that China is its own force in the region. For now, anyway, that's just not going to change. It doesn't mean you can't push it or cajole it or benefit from it, but it is the kind of the magnet of the region. Beyond that, though, to your point, it has dominance in many industries: EVs, rare earths, intermediate goods, different types of technology. That's not going to change in the near future. So how can India actually benefit from that? And I actually argue in some ways it's a blessing on rare earths because India doesn't have to spend $5 trillion in 25 years figuring out how to do it. You already have access to it. And it doesn't mean that the Chinese won't use that as a potential trade weapon, or they can, but India and China also recognize, I would argue, that we're at a different time, right? This is not 5 or 10 years ago. The world is changing rapidly. It's probably more efficient to do business with each other moving forward than it is potentially other parties, such as the United States. I think you also have the opportunity for a lot more FDI from Chinese firms into India. One of the things we've seen with the launch of Trade War 1.0 in 2017, 2018, is that the phrase in Washington, D.C. was ABC, anywhere but China, right? And this is kind of where the China plus one strategy came about, right? Maybe you have a primary facility in China, then you have maybe a secondary facility in Southeast Asia, maybe Mexico, right, or Latin America, and that's kind of how you dealt with those issues. But now that everybody has tariffs and everybody's probably going to have some form of issue with the United States, now we have to rely on each other. So what does that mean? It means building out your supply chains, right, your infrastructure, accepting investment from foreign players, be they Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, or whoever. And sure, understandably, in some sectors it's a no-go because there's national security concerns. But in other areas, do we really care? I would argue you don't. One of the things we've seen is with Chinese supply chains is as they have extended, for example, from China into Southeast Asia, products made in Southeast Asia would then go back and are sold into China. And to your point, of course, there's a trade imbalance between China and India. This is potentially one area to explore of what products are the Chinese making that they're having problems with, maybe because of cost, or it's an area where they don't really, there's some products they just don't want to make anymore because they're moving up the value chain. Maybe that's something India can do. And by producing that, then you can sell that back into China. Everybody kind of wins, right? Chinese firms can continue to sell the product because they have the technology, the know-how, the people, the skill sets. India can benefit from the FDI, right, and getting new machinery, new tooling, new sets of understanding, build up workers, train them, and so on, and new energy or new industries or skill sets. And so that is kind of where I see a lot of this potential moving. It's not just, hey, we don't want to trade in certain areas. That may be true to some degree, but there are definite benefits both countries have that they can rely on each other that maybe before wasn't possible. I think the one thing, to be honest, that the Americans haven't really understood is the response, particularly of Asians, to what they're doing. Every country, and my remit is essentially from the Middle East to Japan to Mongolia to Australia. Even though I live in Shanghai, I travel all over. And every place I go to, every country I talk to, every policymaker, they are all upset. Some are very angry about what the U.S. is doing. And so that gives an opportunity for us to reevaluate our relationships. Maybe it is a good idea for India to consider membership in a free trade agreement or maybe not a free trade agreement, but a trade agreement such as the CPTPP or the RCEP, right? Because these ultimately...
in the context of a free trade agreement, sorry to interrupt, one of our ministers recently expressed his concern in a perhaps not a completely appropriate way. In the context of ASEAN, he said ASEAN is a B team of China, and I think what he probably meant is that the whole transshipment issue, goods instead of coming directly from China, they come from the ASEAN countries and they bypass whatever barriers which may have come into play. And so there is this entire concern about Chinese overcapacity leading to dumping in India, which could affect Indian domestic manufacturers as well. So this is a concern which Indian policymakers really have.
They should be concerned because the reality is China has the capacity to flood any market anywhere in the world with goods. I think, though, you can address that. In my recent discussions and visits to Southeast Asia, you are hearing from them that Chinese policymakers have signaled that they know overcapacity is a challenge and that they're willing to be more sensitive to industries that are particularly building up domestically, right? And that's a great thing because, to your point, yes, you do not want to be flooded, but at the same time, the Chinese have the money and the technology, right? So what is this balance that we can do? And I have to tell you, living inside China, they call it neijuan, which basically means extremely intense competition. It's great if you're a consumer. It's terrible if you're a business.
Neijuan.
Neijuan. Yeah. Basically means fierce internal competition, right? Every business, this is why you see price wars in Chinese EV companies, right? I'm going to lower this by 1,000 RMB. Oh, that doesn't mean anything. I'm going to lower it by 2,500 RMB, right? So you have this incredible competition that goes on, and it's great if you're a consumer, but it's terrible for a business. You're not going to make any money. And companies are now realizing this, and the government has realized this. And I've actually argued that we've probably seen the end of, or the beginning of the end of what we know as Chinese overcapacity. But what does that mean? It means some Chinese companies that weren't able to make it on the market, but do have technology, are willing to sell it. They're willing to, perhaps maybe, for example, form a JV with an Indian firm. And the Indian firm can use Chinese technology to develop a native, industrialized chain in India, as an example.
Question of technology transfer, Cameron, there is a lot of concern about the Chinese government blocking certain technologies from being transferred. There isn't really that much of optimism about technology transfer between India and China so far. Do you think that's going to change? Is there a chance of it changing? Because everybody they want to hold on to their technological advantage, right? So why would China transfer technology to India?
Well, the reality is China has world-class technology in so many industries, but it also has older technology in all those same industries as well, right? The Chinese do not want to lose their today's technology, 2025, maybe 2024. Does 2022 really matter? No. All right. And technology in some countries is 1995. When I go into certain factories and I see some of the machinery, I'm like, this is basically from the 90s. So there's plenty of room and capacity. So yes, technology of today, I would agree with you, probably not going to happen. But of a couple years ago, particularly if the Chinese company is going to be acquired, or if they're going to go out of business because of this intense competition in the country, of course they're willing to sell it. The government doesn't want that business or that company to go bankrupt or out of business, because then it creates more problems. And so ultimately, there's a win-win. And again, the challenge is you have to find where that balance is. And it's different for every company and technology and industry. But it's definitely there. And I can tell you, particularly in my conversations the last couple of months with Chinese firms, they're definitely interested in licensing and selling, whatever it may be, this technology, because the other thing, it's just sitting around. They have the technology of today that they're using to develop today's products, but the technology they used to develop a product 2-3 years ago, it's just sitting there. Or the machines are just sitting there. They're not making those products anymore, right? Because they moved up the value chain. So these are all areas of potential optimism I have on how you can kind of expand and develop supply chains here.
Right. On the question of expanding and developing supply chains, Cameron, I mean, when I've spoken to, anecdotally speaking, I can talk about the fact that there is plenty of interest in the Indian business community in terms of exploring business opportunities in China. So you're based in Shanghai. You are a supply chain guru from China, from the Chinese perspective, so to speak. So where do you see, what would you advise an Indian businessman, say an exporter who's now facing the heat from the American side, and he's looking at his books and he's wondering, what are the alternatives for me? Like, which direction would you point him to? I mean, generally speaking.
I think there's a lot of directions, and this is part of the problem. What we've seen, though, what we've learned from trade wars 1.0, sanctions, and now trade war 2.0, is that there are always other markets to explore. Maybe it's not the U.S. market, maybe it's the Australian market, right? Maybe you don't manufacture everything in India. Maybe you have an India plus one strategy, right? I've actually talked to several Indian firms who are now putting up secondary facilities in the Middle East or East Africa to take advantage of other regional sources, and also tariffs are lower for the U.S. I think on top of that, you can also take a look at how can I upskill and upgrade my technology and machinery. It's very challenging to do if you're a small enterprise, I understand that. But when you look at kind of the medium players, India, of course, has world-class companies and technologies in many areas, electronics as an example. But there's not that many companies who do that. And then it has, a greater number of kind of what we call mid-tier, right? Professional companies that, they're medium-sized in terms of the industry. They have capacities, talent, machinery, and they can move up the value chain as things continue to progress. And then you have a lot of SMEs, kind of the small enterprise.
MSMEs also.
Yeah. And those basically filter everywhere. And essentially, I look at this, to your point, kind of in historical way, this is exactly what China was just after WTO. It's almost the exact same situation. So one of the things I look at and evaluate, given India's size, there's no place like home. You are the most populous country in the world, one with an incredible history, and the ability to actually scale up here is unprecedented. I'll give you an example. In Vietnam, they have 15 million workers in manufacturing. That's about 30% of the population. China has 225 million. When you include everybody, that's again about 28, 29% of the population. In India, it's tens of millions. So the ability to scale up here and massively expand is unprecedented anywhere in the world, and nobody else can really do that. The countries of Germany, Japan, South Korea, United States to some degree, are all deindustrializing. They're all past peak manufacturing. The only places in the world where you can grow manufacturing at scale, and by scale I mean get huge capacity to produce large-scale volume production, is essentially China and India. Africa is, that'll probably be the next generation. But at the moment, as of 2025 and the next 25 years, that's the only two places that can do that. So if I'm an Indian businessman, which I'm not, and I'm very cognizant that, I am the guy from China, so a lot of times people hold that against me, but my point is that look at some of these historical examples we have. As the Chinese were hit with these tariffs, with sanctions, with other things, and it wasn't just the U.S., Japan did something similar, right? Korea did something similar. they looked for other markets. They looked for, if I add a machine here and I develop a more unique, different kind of product, it opens up a new market where I have a higher margin business, and that gives me more flexibility overall in my business to move up the value chain or to get different unique customers so they can support my business as I try to figure out, how to deal with this challenge I have, right?
Right. In terms of scale, Cameron, you're very right that India has the potential to sort of scale up in manufacturing. The only other comparable entity is China. And India has been talking about this in terms of a demographic dividend. We've got a huge young population, and China, on the other hand, is actually is going to be going down the demographic slope pretty soon. But there is also this danger of this in a demographic dividend sort of being frittered away, because we have not been able to translate it into a huge population of skilled human resources, especially in the high-tech sectors where they are needed. So there is a skill gap, even though there is no gap. There is not a problem in terms of the sheer number of talent available. So China has been able to make this transition in terms of generating a huge amount of readily available pool of skilled workers and talent. So how do you think India can learn from the Chinese experience in this regard to also maybe generate this kind of a talent pool at scale?
I think there's a few things. The first is, the average age of India, if I recall correctly, is under 30. Is that correct, roughly? Vietnam's 33, Japan's almost 50, China's 40. So India, again, when you look at scale, manufacturing, production, has this capacity that nobody else in the world has. And you have a little bit of time. So I agree with you that there are challenges with skill sets, building up workers. But the reality is the population is young enough. You have a little bit of time to figure out, not a lot, but a little. I visited the Shanghai Semiconductor Show at the end of March, and they had a booth there, kind of this organization that gets internships for young engineering graduates and so on and so forth. So this year when I talked to them, what they did is they said, we're going to train and educate 100,000 workers in these new areas that the government has identified, such as AI, quantum computing, batteries, robotics, so on and so forth. So how are they doing that? They're working with universities to redo some of the courses towards the end of the term. When you talk about the challenge of talent, the cross-pollination of talent, but also understanding how other businesses and industries work and bringing that into your own business can actually accelerate a lot of that and solve some of that challenge.
Right. Speaking of this cross-pollination of talent that you mentioned, one of the things which many people easily talk about when you're talking about India as an alternative manufacturing hub, or even as a spoke with some other country being the hub, is labor. The cost of labor is pretty cheap in India, and it's also been a significant factor in terms of India's performance in the software sector as well. So we've done we've sort of leveraged labor costs, especially with the US as well. So you, on the other hand, as a supply chain person, you have been talking about an entire ecosystem making the difference and not just labor. And that comes up also in conversations about Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and in the context of India also. So can you speak a little bit about what this ecosystem should be, especially as India tries to up the game in terms of its growth trajectory with a focus on manufacturing as well, in this new kind of a global economy where there is this trade war happening, but we need to up our ecosystem game, so to speak. How would you evaluate it, and where does India stand vis-a-vis a country like Vietnam, for instance, or China?
Sure, and I think one way I look at it is there's 5 key pillars of a supply chain ecosystem. The first is advanced infrastructure, right? It's not just ports and railroads, which are obvious, but it's also things like 5G, the electrical grid, or sewer systems. The next is talent and educational apparatus. It's important to have people, and to your point about how do you train them, how do you skill them, when new technologies or products come along, how do you constantly innovate with them, right, and grow their own skill sets. Then you have government support, and sometimes that means subsidies, other times it means tariffs. The next is kind of raw material access and or the ability to process. And when you look at one of the interesting things about China, they don't have as many raw materials or rare earths as you think, but they have absolute dominance in the processing. And the last is technology. And technology can mean many different things. In this particular case, I mean actually the ability to take technology and kind of move up the value chain or solve problems in your supply chain. So those are 5 key pillars. And so when I look at a supply chain, when I look at a country, I essentially evaluate in those 5 key areas, because that will tell you where some of the challenges. When I evaluate kind of India and its relationship to Southeast Asia in terms of talent and cost per labor, I don't look at it in terms of just the labor cost. It's a part of the picture, but I evaluate it within, again, those 5 key areas. If, for example, you're in Vietnam and it's cheaper, because if I can call my friend Wang Peng in Shenzhen and I can get the product in 2 days and I can make it, ship it out and make some money, no problem. If, though, I'm in India and I'm like, well, it's going to take me 2.5 weeks to get this material, or the material's twice as like, it just doesn't help you, right? And so again, I'm trying to figure out in Asia, because there is, as you rightly pointed out, kind of a distinction. There's East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And in some ways, they're 3 very distinct regions. In some ways, they're all the same. And so part of the things I'm trying to look at supply chains is, how do we link some of that up and remove some of those challenges, not just in the business community, but also, when you have goods flow, if goods are flowing, people are flowing. If people are flowing, you probably don't have as many problems as you would if that wasn't happening.
I think Bangladesh is a country which has been sort of moving the needle on this very issue, if I'm not mistaken.
It is, and I have talked to some Bangladeshi policymakers and scholars about this, and one of the questions they ask me is, how can we get access, when will the Chinese build a railway system into Bangladesh so we can ship stuff back and forth easier? And my comment to them was, well, you need to go talk to the Indians first, But again, lower hanging fruits. And as somebody who lives in China, I'm not naive at all to the challenges that these different countries have amongst each other. Or in my own country, the United States has incredible challenges with China. But I think when you look at how connecting things and connecting people solve some of the problems that we have, that's what I try to focus on, right? Because we could complain all day long about all the problems, but how do we actually fix some of this stuff?
Right. My last question to you, Cameron, it's not strictly related to what we've been discussing so far, but this is something I'm curious about, which is what is happening with AI in China. There was this DeepSeek moment everybody had. India too had it. I mean, there was a lot of breastbeating in India, but where is India's DeepSeek? Where are we in the AI front? So how is AI being developed in China? We know what's been happening with ChatGPT and so on. Is there a lot of difference? Are they pretty much ahead? Are they at the same stage? What is your observations as somebody who's there?
When China compared to the United States in AI is definitely ahead. And I have to tell you, my American friends voraciously fight against me on that and argue with me. But I look at it again, look at the ecosystem I just mentioned. China controls the germanium and the antimony for the chips. So if you're a local chip producer in China, semiconductor producer, and you want to change your formulation, maybe you want to try a different style of chip, maybe you want to design it slightly differently, you have that capacity already there because the raw materials are there. Secondly, when you look at just the talent, China produces several million engineers every year. The United States produces maybe 125,000, maybe. So the scale of talent that you have available to help you with some of your challenges is unprecedented. You have an electrical grid. China basically builds a Germany plus 25% every year now in its electrical grid. So if you need a data center, if you're a college and you need a new research center because you're building out AI, robotics or something, all of a sudden you have access to ample electricity. Electricity is not an issue at all in China anymore. It was up until about 3 or 4 years ago, but now it's not. In the US, it's a massive issue. They will not be able to build out their AI and infrastructure grid how they think they will just because of the challenges there. In my world of supply chains and manufacturing, there are about 25 or 30 different programs now that I know factories are using. And often we're inputting data and trying to understand where are the bottlenecks in my business. Sometimes it's, hey, I'm having quality issues, so I'm going to download all of the quality data from my machines into this program and figure out, this machine when it makes this material, it's fantastic, but when it makes that material, it's terrible. How do I do that? One factory or set of factories I visited about 3 or 4 months ago, they're using DeepSeek in their factory. It's a very large company. Large meaning the mid-level is probably $125, $150 million a year business, primarily export. And they have huge R&D teams that are now playing with this. And when I talked to the owner, I said, why are you who make consumer goods using this? Because that's not what you would think, right? You think AI is in a technology company, right? Or maybe it's a SOE trying to figure it out. But these guys are using it. He said, I have over 100 engineers and IT guys. Business is slow. I need to figure out how to use this stuff to improve my business. How can I save a couple points on my margin, right? How can I be more efficient in my operations? Because then, as you start to eat away those points, you actually make more money and have more buffer, right? Particularly with the tariffs. Particularly in an American context, China's ahead. Now, at the end of the day, 5 or 10 years, will they be? I don't know. But the reality is that the U.S. will be dominant, for now at least, in breakthroughs. But China will be dominant in the adoption and application of AI. When you look at the kind of the Chinese use of AI, it's very unique. And hopefully, I would encourage anybody to take a look at it. I understand there's people who have problems with Chinese models, but because it's open source, you can localize it and build it out yourself. So ultimately, you'll benefit as well.
That's really fascinating to hear, Cameron, the difference as you sort of framed it. The US is ahead in terms of breakthroughs, but the Chinese are ahead in terms of adoption and application. That's really an interesting way of thinking about it. That's all I have for you in this edition of InFocus. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to have you back again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you.